members of the audience, because we're in the big hall and obviously we've split into 4 groups, we have a lot of seats to choose from. So if people do want to move closer to the front, please do feel free to do so. And it means anyone coming late then can slip into the seats at the back. You're very welcome to this afternoon session of this European Regional Meeting. My name's Nat O'Connor and I'm the Director of TASC. And I'll give you a moment to settle yourselves and then we'll begin proceedings. So first of all, I'd just like to quickly thank the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform for holding this event and for allowing TASC to hold its event in cooperation with the Nordic embassies here and also the International Ombudsman Institute this afternoon, talking about the Nordic Models. TASC is Ireland's independent progressive think tank, and we've had a role in various parts of the OGP process here in Ireland in terms of generating Ireland's first action plan. And as an organisation, TASC is interested in issues of economic equality and also democratic accountability and how we strengthen our democracy, and OGP very much speaks to that. This is the 3rd Nordic Models seminar. We had 2 seminars before in cooperation with the Nordic embassies, and we're delighted to have the chance to do so again today, and equally with the Ombudsman Institute. And of course, when talking about the Nordic Models, we've tried to stress that there are many differences between the Nordic countries as well as similarities, and also that we can have a fruitful exchange in both directions between the Nordic countries and Ireland, and indeed the full range of countries represented here today. Of course, a number of open government traditions were born in the Nordic countries, not least the Ombudsman tradition, and a number of our speakers will speak about the role of Ombudsman, a growing role across the world, but also the first Freedom of Information law in 1766, for Sweden and of course Finland at the time, and many other institutions which again our speakers will speak about, which have led in turn to norms of governing, public expectations about openness and transparency in the Nordic countries, which helps explain why they're among the longest running democracies on earth. And again, we'll learn a bit about that today. I'm not going to say too much because my job is to keep everything to time. The way we've done the Nordic Models seminars before is we try and have a good discussion with you towards the end. So what I'm going to do is invite each speaker in turn to make their contribution. If there's any burning questions, stick up your hand and we'll take those. But what we'll try and do is get through the contributions from the panel, and then we have time at the end, at least half an hour or more, to have a rich debate of all of the issues arising from our contributions today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to His Excellency, the Ambassador of Norway, Roald Næss, who will set the scene and give us some introductory remarks.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of all the organisers, I am delighted to welcome you to this session of the Nordic Models, and to the important discussion on freedom of information, the right to know, and how this crucial right is implemented. Let me start with a broad and short, a broad theme but a short reminder. The first and very successful democracy in ancient Athens lasted for approximately 250 years. It fell apart because privileges, corruptions, and mismanagement took over, and the democratic attitudes disintegrated. The second democratic experience in the history of humankind is now approaching 250 years. To prevent it from suffering the same fate as the first one, we all have a responsibility to engage in keeping it alive. And the Open Government Partnership has a particular role in this regard. The history of democratic governance is relatively short compared with other forms of governance. Consequently, we cannot simply adopt democracy and think it will last forever. A democracy requires political leaders, business leaders, officials, and citizens with a democratic attitude rooted in democratic values. Attitude is something we get from education and social interaction. We have to learn it. In a real democracy, human rights and democratic values has to be an integral part of education and promoted in social interaction on a daily basis. The so-called Western countries have developed their democracies to today's standard over a long period, and these standards have to be developed further in the years to come. In Norway, we celebrate the 200th anniversary of our Constitution of 1814 next week. The Constitution is an expression of freedom, independence, and democracy. We have been fighting for it ever since it was adopted. First, we were challenged by Sweden. In 1940, we were occupied by Hitler's Germany. And on the 22nd of July 2011, a single person launched a terror attack on our democracy. The response to this horrible attack was more democracy, more openness, and greater political participation. In the eastern part of Europe, many countries are still struggling to establish real and sustainable democracies. Proper institutions and laws may be in place. Human rights instruments may have been ratified, but the attitude from a non-democratic period still prevails in parts of the society. However, progress is being made, but the enemies of democracies should not be underestimated. There is a threat both from inside and outside. In one particular country, we can observe it on the news every day. In other parts of the world, people have expressed a strong desire for a democratic development, unfortunately without success. In North Africa and the Middle East, the Arab Spring has lost its momentum. In order to nurture the democracy, we must promote and protect some basic civil and political rights, in particular the freedom of association, the freedom of expression, and the freedom of information. In addition to separation of power, these rights and freedoms are a guarantee for checks and balances to function properly in a society. Otherwise, privileges, corruption, and mismanagement may again take hold and lead to disintegration of the democracy. Transparency International reminds us every year that corruption remains a global threat, and to a certain degree it is also present in the most democratic states. The Corruption Index 2013, published by Transparency International, serves as a reminder. The index scores 177 countries. No country has a perfect score, and the report indicates a serious worldwide corruption problem. One of the measures proposed by Transparency International is to make public institutions more transparent. The 4 Nordic countries present here today are fortunately among the top 5 countries on a list of less corruption. I firmly believe that it has to do with the models we have developed over the years, taking advantage of best practices in each of the other countries. The Nordic countries are often referred to as being successful, enjoying economic efficiency and growth combined with peaceful labor relations, social cohesion, a fair distribution of income, and high quality of life. Although critics have questioned the sustainability of this success, the models of development have proven to be relatively resilient in the face of the global economic and financial crisis over the years. I believe transparency and a deep-rooted democratic attitude is a predominant factor and reason for this flattering status. Active participation of the citizens in local and national affairs is another important factor, but I should add that indifference in terms of political participation is also a feature in parts of the population in the Nordic countries. In conclusion, to prevent our democracies from extinction, we all have a responsibility to engage in keeping it alive in organizations, at the workplace, in education, in media, and in everyday life. As I said, the Open Government Partnership has a particular role in this regard. As a final appeal, I would like to rewrite John F. Kennedy. We should not ask what democracy can do for us, but what we can do for democracy. I thank you for your attention, and I now invite Nat O'Connor to come and share this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roald. So I'm going to pass on to our next speaker, Arne Fliflet, who is the Parliamentary Ombudsman for Public Administration in Norway, and who has many years' experience in the role of Ombudsman, and indeed active in the interaction between Ombudsmen around the world. And I hand over to Arne Fliflet.
Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you for organizing this conference. Well, thank you to the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. It is also a privilege for me to talk to you about the Norwegian Ombudsman's role in supervising freedom of information legislation in Norway. But first of all, I would like to convey some good words to the Swedes, who we normally compete with. But in this respect, we cannot compete, because the Swedish, they created the Ombudsman institution long before the Norwegian constitution was a reality. But we tried in 1814, when we got the constitution on May 17th, which is next week. And we had a provision in our constitution about the freedom of information. And I think it's fair to say that the Swedes were the inspiration for this constitutional paragraph. However, I also must admit that the Norwegians did not take very much notice of that provision in the beginning. So it took many years until we had our Freedom of Information Act in 1970. But we learn in Norway, and I think it is fair to say that the Swedish government is a very open government, and also have an open governance, as the Swedish ambassador emphasized yesterday. And Sweden also had invented the Ombudsman institution long before 1814. But I can tell you that in 1814, in our Constitutional Assembly, a Swede had written a note to one of the members of the Norwegian Constitutional Assembly, telling him that you should never establish an ombudsman institution. But the man who told the Norwegian constitutionalists not to establish such an institution, he had earlier taken part in an uproar against the Swedish king, so he had to flee to Denmark. So he lived in exile in Denmark. Well, that was a little story to start with. The Freedom of Information Act of 19th May 2006, the Public Administration Act 10th February 1967, and Archives Act of 4th December 1999, together with their respective regulations, are the central Norwegian legislative documents regulating the public's right to access information found within the different bodies of the public administration. To ensure transparency in the local governing bodies, the Local Government Act also regulates the right of access to meetings of popular elected bodies on municipal or county level. In the last few years, the European Convention on Human Rights also has played a more important role in the decisions pertaining to the right to information, especially after being incorporated into Norwegian law in 1999. And we see that complaints now refer not only to the Freedom of Information Act when complaining about a lack of public transparency, but also to the ECHR, in particular to Article 10. One important premise of transparency and freedom of information is that the public also has the possibility of finding out what information is actually available. The obligation to keep records and the right to access these records found both in the Freedom of Information Act and the regulations under the Archives Act are therefore fundamental to democratic participation, public control, and legal protection. The electronic public records, the OEP, as we say, a public record-keeping database which any person with internet access can use, has also played an important role in ensuring public transparency in the last years. And I think this OEP is, we are proud of that in Norway, I might say. It is the responsibility of the Norwegian Parliamentary Ombudsman to investigate whether the public authorities, in the course of their dealings with the general public, have made errors or treated people unjustly. It is also his prerogative to issue legal opinions on such matters. Almost all public bodies and therefore most parts of the public administration can be investigated by the Ombudsman. Such investigations will in many cases include a review of whether the public authorities have respected and safeguarded human rights and whether cases have been handled in accordance with good administrative practice. Supervision is mostly carried out on the basis of complaints from citizens concerning any maladministration or injustice on the part of a public agency. But the Ombudsman also addresses issues on his own initiative on the basis of information from the press, journalists, etc. The Ombudsman's role supervising the Norwegian public administration also encompasses ensuring that public officials follow the rules that regulate freedom of information and the right to information in the public sector. Amongst others, this includes the right to access documents to and from the Norwegian government, both on state, municipal and county levels, the right to information about who has applied for public administrative positions, and the right to access to the meetings of the political bodies governing on municipal and county level. The Ombudsman also addresses questions concerning the time the public administration uses to process requests to access documents and information. I will come back to some examples of cases the Norwegian Ombudsman has had in these different areas. The Ombudsman's supervision of the public administration has shown to be both important and effective. Even though the Ombudsman doesn't have the authority to reverse the public administration's actual decisions. His opinions, often published as so-called statements, are considered as important legal source document in Norway and are frequently quoted, for example in legal literature and in draft resolutions, white papers and decisions made by public authorities. One of the reasons for this is that even though the administrative body is not obliged to act in accordance with the Ombudsman's opinion, a quick search in the Ombudsman's archives shows that most government bodies will at the least take note of the Ombudsman's stated opinions. In cases where the decisions to withhold documents from the public are the reason for complaint, the end result might not always be that the decision is completely reversed, but in most cases, the decision to withhold documents from the public is almost always reconsidered, and in not a few cases, at least partially reversed, resulting in the partial release of documents or to the public that were withheld prior to the case being brought in before the Ombudsman. It is also not uncommon to quote the Ombudsman's statements as reason for suggesting a new bill or amending an existing act, thereby ensuring that what originally started as the Ombudsman's legal opinion actually becomes the law. Examples of this is found in the draft resolution of the Freedom of Information Act and in the draft resolution to the amendment of the article regulating the right of access to meetings in popularly elected bodies in the Local Government Act. The Ombudsman's office receives around 3,000 complaints every year. Last year, 174 of these complaints concerned public transparency and the right to information. In the last few years, the Ombudsman's office has issued statements concerning several important topics concerning freedom of information. The last year, the Ombudsman has issued statements on the right to be informed about who is being considered for top-level government positions, which considerations the public authority must take when considering if a document should be released to the public, and recently a statement pertaining to right to access to the meeting of the political bodies governing on municipal and county level. Especially in cases concerning the right to information, the Ombudsman several times has stated that it is of importance that the requests are processed quickly, in most cases within 1 to 3 days. The Ministry of Justice has supported the Ombudsman's view, and in their official guide to the Freedom of Information Act, it is stated clearly that the requirements in Section 29 so process requests without undue delay is usually understood to be within 1 or 2 to 3 days. The Ombudsman has also made it clear that the government body must be completely independent of others when considering if a document can be released to the public or not, and has also several times questioned if documents that have been accepted actually contain information that is necessary to accept. Let me now say a few words about the right to information about who is applying for positions in the public administration or in the courts, which is a very recent case going on. According to the Norwegian Freedom of Information Act, a public list of applicants is to be prepared before appointing someone employed in a position in the public administration. This also applies if a private headhunting firm is used to find possible candidates for the position. This list is to be prepared shortly after the deadline for application has passed, usually within 2 to 3 days, and must contain the name, age, sex and professional title of each applicant. In earlier cases, the Ombudsman has stated that when public positions are advertised, applicants should be made aware of the fact that their names will be listed and that the list might be public. An applicant can request to be exempt from the list, but only if certain requirements have been met. There are several examples of such requests being granted without prior consideration, and the Ombudsman has therefore stated in many cases that any such request must be considered individually by the public body advertising the position. Oh yes. How much? 1 minute? Give me 1 minute more. Sometimes the deadline for application is postponed, but the recruitment process is started before the deadline has passed. Since it's not necessary to compile the list until after the deadline has passed, this gives the applicants who don't make it through the first cut the chance to withdraw their applications before the list is compiled. But anyway, the latest example which I mentioned, the Supreme Court Justice list, revealed last week that 5 lawyers applying for the Supreme Court judgeship wanted to be exempted from the list, and they were exempted. But I've already have some journalists on the telephone asking what's happening, and they can very likely prepare a complaint, which I think will come soon. So it is my belief, but let us now conclude, since we can come back to other things in the discussion, that the Ombudsman's work and role supervising the government authorities to ensure that they are sufficiently transparent in their work and that freedom of information is ensured being effective and has had a positive impact on the openness and transparency regarding the application process in the public administration in Norway. It is also my belief that the Ombudsman Institute is of great importance in ensuring continued openness and transparency, and that the Ombudsman's work in this area never will be done. So far, thank you for your attention, and sorry for extending your patience.
Thank you very much, Arne, for that and for that introduction. And there are, of course, many features familiar when we look at the Ombudsman role and the freedom of information role as you describe them, and yet some cultural differences, such as undue delay being 2 or 3 days in Norway, whereas there are requests in Ireland which have been 2 or 3 years in the waiting. So there could be a great difference in the culture that might underlie the similar institutions. I'd like now to invite the Irish Ombudsman and Information Commissioner, who also had the role previously of being the Ombudsman for Wales, Mr. Peter Tyndall, to speak about his experience.
Thank you, Nat. It's good to see you all in Dublin. I hope now that the sun's come out that you'll have a chance to enjoy the sights as well as to enjoy the very stimulating conference programme that we've been having. I'm particularly here not in my context as Information Commissioner. The Minister made some reference to, or rather my predecessor Emily O'Reilly made some reference to remarks I'd made in launching my annual report as Information Commissioner yesterday, which was later described as a hospital pass. Those of you who know the context will understand that that's the time where the tackler and the bowl arrive at the same time, and getting out of the way is impossible. For what it's worth, I did express a view on fees, but it wasn't quite the one that appeared in the press this morning, but such is life. I'm actually here principally in the context of a submission that was made by the International Ombudsman Institute to the conference organisers to try and find some space to talk about the role of Ombudsman within the Open Government Partnership. The tradition thus far within the partnership has largely been, and particularly in a European context, has largely been featuring on data issues and freedom of information issues. But I think there's a case to be made for a wider approach to open government, which can see Ombudsman playing a more significant part. When you think about what the aspirations of the Open Government Partnership are, making governments more transparent. Well, what Ombudsmen do, and I'll come and talk a little about the history of the institution, which Arne has already referred to. Ombudsmen are principally about bridging a power gap between citizens and the state. What they're about doing is representing the interests of the individual citizen in a circumstance where, for them being able to uphold their own case is much more problematic. Sometimes it's referred to as speaking truth to power. Now, fundamentally, what open government is about is also bridging that power gap between citizen and the state, in allowing people to be engaged as active partners in governance, rather than as passive recipients of governance. And so there is a certain parallel. And when you look at the aspirations, making government more transparent, I would argue that one of the ways in which ombudsmen work, which is highlighting both individual and systemic failures of government, is fundamental to transparency. Because it's fine to be transparency about the routine business of government, but being transparent about the failures of government is actually one of the more significant forms of transparency. And also, the OGP aspirations, making government more accountable. Well, it's one of the jobs of ombudsmen to assist parliaments in holding governments to account by providing them with information about what's happening to individual citizens, which enables them to ask the kind of searching questions which will lead to improvements in the way that public services are delivered. And the further aspiration, making governments more responsive to their own citizens. Well, clearly, one of the key responses to citizens is actually putting things right when things go wrong for citizens. And ombudsmen have a critical role to play there, both for the individual, but particularly for driving improvements across the piece in public services. Now, I want to say a little bit about the history because I think it's relevant. We've heard from Arne that Sweden was the originator of the concept of ombudsman. It's often dated back just over 200 years, but originally there was a king's ombudsman, which is an interesting stepping stone along the way, and that was in 1713. So going back quite a long way, but that person wasn't independent of the administration, in fact working for the king clearly, and the king having exclusive power at the time. That person was far from being what we know as ombudsman today. But the Swedish Constitution of 1809, I'm probably stealing Elizabet's thunder, yes, but you can talk about Ireland. Established the Parliamentary Ombudsman, and we're very privileged to have Elizabet with us here today. But it's often, the concept as we know it in this part of the world comes from Denmark, where it was originally, in 1955, the Danish Ombudsman model, which doesn't quite have the same supervisory capacities as either the Swedish or the Norwegian models do, but is rather more related to providing redress to individual citizens. Now, it's been an extraordinary, we're talking about Nordic models, this has been an extraordinarily successful one. At the last count, more than 135 UN member states had a parliamentary ombudsman style of institution. The International Ombudsman Institute was established in 1978, and it has 160 members in more than 90 countries. So this is a concept that originated in the Nordic countries, which has found resonance across the world. And in some instances, I'd like to say it's found resonance across the democratic world, which it has, but there are some unlikely ombudsman institutions in situations where democracy and transparency have yet to emerge. Now, the International Ombudsman Institute has been very keen indeed to encourage ombudsmen to play an active part in open government partnerships. And we'll hear from our colleague from the World Bank some examples of ombudsmen outside of Europe who are doing precisely that. Ombudsmen are an interesting hybrid creature because we go beyond the rule of law in terms of what we try to do for the citizen. We're looking at concepts like maladministration, but principally issues like fairness or justice, as Arne described it. So you're actually looking at not just did somebody have what the law said they should have, but were they treated fairly? And that makes the concept, I think, why it is so powerful and why it's such an important alternative to the courts as a means of redress for citizens. And I think in much of Europe now, where free access to the courts in the past through legal aid and so on is being eroded as part of the measures taken to combat the economic crisis, the Ombudsman institution has become more important because for many citizens it's the only access to redress because they cannot afford to access courts. And it's also, I think, as Arne again alluded, it's about promoting good administration, not simply about dealing with failures, but it's also about saying to people you are entitled to be treated well by the state, even when you're not. Now, I want to talk about the business of how transparency from ombudsman helps to promote learning through the state and helps to hold government to account. At its most basic level, every ombudsman institution produces an annual report which sets out the findings in the course of the year and highlights failings of government. It usually looks at, ombudsmen usually produce reports about individual cases where there is learning to be had or which need to be brought to public attention. They often produce systemic reports where there are failures across a particular service which involve more than one person but actually stem from failings in the way that service has been established or operated. Increasingly, ombudsmen are publishing case books of their work. More and more ombudsmen are now publishing online the results of every case that they examine. And that's starting to provide a very useful learning tool for the providers of public services. And as Arne has said, that's starting to change, that's starting to drive changes, not just in public administration, but in the law, because it becomes clear that some of the failings we identify fall within that. And ombudsmen as well use the court of public opinion very effectively. When things are not being responded to by public bodies in the way that they ought to be, most ombudsmen are very capable of drawing the attention of the wider public to failings through the media. Now, in Ireland, as an office, we did actively engage in commenting upon the development of the action plan for OGP. We put forward a number of proposals, and hopefully we will see some of those being taken on board. I want to just talk a little bit about one of the issues that we put forward as a suggestion, which I think could become an important part of the transparency agenda going forward. One of the things that many ombudsmen will note is that often when public bodies deal with complaints from citizens, the citizen may have had no reason whatsoever to be unhappy, or they may be unhappy, but they may not have been badly treated. But the way their complaint is dealt with is dreadful. And people often wait a very long time to get complaints resolved. Statistics about complaints are notoriously absent other than from ombudsman reports. Very difficult to know how many complaints are being received by public bodies typically. It's difficult to compare the data and why people use different means of dealing with complaints, which means they're not collecting data about them in a comparable way. One of the things that I've strongly advocated as ombudsman here, and we've seen it develop elsewhere in Europe, is a role for Ombudsman in determining how the complaints system should be configured so that there's a standard way of complaining that all citizens can access, so that there are standard portals that citizens can go to complain and they don't have to find their way through a maze. It becomes all the more important in the context of public services, often now delivered by private bodies or NGOs and not necessarily by public bodies. It becomes harder and harder to find out who's responsible and how to get redress. So one of the things we're promoting very actively in Ireland is a standardised approach to complaints, allied to a standardised production of statistics about complaints, so that the evidence about failings in our public services can be open and readily available to all citizens and can be used in the business of holding government to account. The question about the role for ombudsmen in the Open Government Partnership will be touched upon later. But I would just say to this that up to now, the partnership has been too narrow. We heard this morning the call for business to be engaged in the partnership. But in fact, there are other bodies which are not part of the state, but which stand as regulatory agencies or as bodies with oversight, which also can very usefully be engaged, not just in the process of formulating action plans or delivering parts of them, but also with a critical role to play, it seems to me, in monitoring compliance. And so I hope to see, going forward, that the work the Ombudsman Institute is doing in collaboration with the World Bank will see many more Ombudsman institutions across the globe actively engaged in driving forward with the Open Government Partnership. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And I think that's an excellent point about the issue of a test of transparency and maturity, I think, in any system is our ability to look at failings and failures and to learn from them and to fully address them. Moving on now to the Swedish experience, but also the international experience, I want to welcome the Ombudsman of Sweden, who's also a member of the International Ombudsman Institute Board of Directors, Elizabet Fura.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I will speak about failure. I will speak about an example from my own country where the government failed and the Ombudsman exposed the failure, so to say. Since my introduction has been stolen by Arne first and then Peter, I can go directly to the point. But I wanted to say something about the word ombudsman is actually Swedish, ombudsman. And it's one of the few words of the Swedish language that we have exported successfully. There are a few others, like smörgåsbord and some others. But so ombudsman is a Swedish word, which is nice. My example is from is on or about failure, as I said, but it turns around the Freedom of Press Act, which is a part of the Swedish Constitution adopted in 1809. And it's based on the principle of public access to official documents held by governmental agencies and other state agencies. Now, you might know or not know, but it's a special feature of my office that we are not only one ombudsman like Arne or Peter, but we are four of us. We are all four elected in our individual capacity by Parliament, and we are reporting to Parliament. But we don't take any instructions from Parliament. Of course, the legislation comes from Parliament, but and the budget, the money comes from Parliament also. But we don't take any instructions. And even if I am the chief parliamentary ombudsman, I cannot interfere in my fellow ombudsman's dealings or decisions. Our mandate is to supervise all governmental agencies, including the courts, the ministries, and the county councils. And we also supervise the local government as well as the individual civil servants and all others who exercise public power. Put differently, you could say that our task is to make sure that public authorities and individual public officials comply with the laws and other statutes and otherwise carry out their duties properly. How do we do this? Well, we deal with complaints filed by private citizens and others. We do inspections, and we take initiatives on our own. My example, like I said, will deal with failure. And this is a practical example from the report we filed with the Parliament in November last year. And it's about the government offices, the ministries, and the principle of public access to information. One of my colleagues, one of the other ombudsmen, had previously criticized the government offices. Of course, the ministers themselves are not under our supervisions. I don't need to tell you that. But the staff employed by the ministries is. And he had been criticizing these offices for their handling of a journalist's request to be given access to official documents. Now, you could say that the case in question, it took the government officials 9 months to give access to this journalist. And the case in question was very unique. And during these 9 months that they were thinking about giving access or not, they also introduced statutory grounds for not disclosing the requested documents. So they legislated, or they took initiative to legislate meanwhile. So it took a little time. The case was exceptional, however. It concerned what became known in my country as the tsunami tapes. This was recorded conversations between officials immediately after the news broke in the middle of the Christmas season 2004 about the tsunami catastrophe in Thailand, killing 543 Swedish citizens and 250,000 people in all. But the inquiry nevertheless demonstrated serious procedural shortcomings at the government offices. The Ombudsman, my colleague, had after that seen signs in more or less significant contexts that these shortcomings persisted. So against this backdrop, he decided on his own initiative to include a number of similar cases with further complaints against the government offices in a relatively extensive inquiry. Now, the results of the inquiry again indicated shortcomings in terms of organization, responsibilities, and procedures at the government offices, which had led on to repeated occasions to a disregard for the requirement under the Freedom of Press Act, a part of the Constitution, as I said, that public documents shall be disclosed promptly. 9 months is not promptly. And I quote from the decision of my colleague: "The inquiry suggests that the shortcomings are of a fundamental nature. The organization is not adapted to the principle of public access to official documents, nor has it been adapted to the changes long since implemented in the organization of the ministries. It appears in this connection that a request which does not lead to an immediate disclosure of the requested document can easily end up in a no man's land, where it's sent around without either officials or ministers being held answerable for extended processing times or other shortcomings that encroach the constitutional right to transparency. I found," my colleague writes, "it particularly remarkable that officials at the government offices appeared to think that processing of the matters under scrutiny had been acceptable. And I therefore added that it's especially important that the offices of the government respect the public right to transparency. Otherwise, there is a considerable risk that other authorities will also stop regarding themselves as obliged to follow the Constitution to the letter, which would eventually amount to a threat against the principle of public access to information. End of quote. Now, these are really harsh words, and it was followed up. This decision was followed up by Parliament, the Committee on Constitutional Affairs, inviting the responsible ministers to come before the committee and explain themselves. This made some public or some political unrest, you can call it. All of them remained in office, but it was quite a story at the time. There was also a case in this same inquiry regarding a journalist who had requested access to documents from the Ministry of Enterprise, Energy and Communications about, and you will love this, internal costs for entertaining staff members. I think it was a Christmas party. And of course, this was a bit of an embarrassment, they thought, so what happened? Nothing happened first. So in the report of the Ombudsman, you can read about shortcomings since disclosure was delayed by general procedures. The case is interesting because it highlights some other issues. Among them, what can the officials do in response to such a request besides prompt disclosure? What can you do? What is acceptable to do and what is not acceptable to do? And the decision by the Ombudsman is to say that documents may not first be circulated as they were in this case. They were circulated in order to give different officials, including the minister herself, the opportunity to comment in general on what should be done. No one wanted to handle this hot potato. It also indicates that an authority is entitled to correct shortcomings discovered after the document has been requested, and even to release information about both discovered shortcomings and applied correctives, on condition, mind you, that this does not delay the procedure, the access, the disclosure. And finally, it was noted by the Ombudsman that the review carried out by the Parliamentary Committee on Constitutional Affairs and the review carried out by him actually overlapped. Not completely, but partially. However, he writes in the decision, from a constitutional point of view, this is to prefer compared to the opposite. No one looks into the matter. As long as the supervision bodies' criticism is limited to their mandate, their respective supervision. So my conclusion, after giving you this example from Sweden, is that transparency is key, and it is really a precondition for democracy and peace. It is never achieved once and for all. It's all very nice to hear everyone accolading Sweden, in particular to say, yeah, you have been doing this for more than 200 years, and we all have you as our role model. But I think it's one of my tasks is to say to my fellow citizens that, yes, it's very nice, but we have also our homework to do. And it's never achieved. You can never say, now it's done, now we can rest. Oppositely, we have to be constantly vigilant, all of us, not only the Ombudsman. And here I think media plays an important role to help the Ombudsman. I would like to finish by using the words of the political philosopher Charles Anderson, an American. And I quote, "There is a public interest in assuring that established practice is always open to challenge, reconsideration, and change." End of quote. I think, ladies and gentlemen, this is what transparency is about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and not least for the reminder of the need for eternal vigilance. Turning now to the world scene and a representative from the World Bank Institute's Access to Information Programme, I'd like to welcome Louis Esquivel.
Thank you very much, Nat, and for the opportunity to be here. I was a little bit worried about having to explain why the World Bank was presenting in this session on the Nordic models, but thanks to Peter, that has been clarified. And yeah, it's to broaden a little bit the perspective on this issue. And and we at the World Bank, this is a rather recent issue that we're starting to look at more closely, because we think that the Ombudsman offices and the Ombudsman institution has a role to play in open government as well as in service delivery and in reducing poverty. And as part of these recent activities that we have done in this regard, we started this collaboration with the International Ombudsman Institute that Peter mentioned. And as you may have seen recently, we had a webinar where Peter presented specifically on this issue. I think that having this debate here on the role of ombudsman institutions in the open government partnership and open government in general is great, as it shows that there is a need to have this discussion and that there is interest for this issue. At the beginning, OGP was designed just including government and civil society, but I think it's as part of this process, as OGP matures and it's becoming more richer, incorporating other stakeholders such as parliaments, the private sector, and of course the ombudsman institutes. And I think this is excellent to be having this discussion here. As I won't elaborate too much on why we think this is important, I think Peter made a great explained it very well, because the ombudsman is this mediator between government and the citizen, and given the nature of OGP, having both actors at the same table, having the experience of this kind of institutions can certainly strengthen the process, the OGP process. There is also the issue of the ombudsman in many cases being responsible for overseeing the implementation of access to information legislation. But there is also one point where I think it could be important to have the engagement of the ombudsman institutions, and that is the issue of continuity in the action plans, and continuing the engagement around OGP. One of the concerns is, or the early concerns about the OGP process was, so what happens when the government changes, right? There's, a lot of governments were very enthusiastic about joining OGP, but then elections came and they changed, and there was certain uncertainty. There was uncertainty as to whether the government would remain engaged. And I think by having ombudsman institutions engaged along the process, they can help to ensure that when new governments come, that there is this, that they remain engaged in this. And just as an example, though it's a little bit different because it's not an ombudsman institution, but it's an access to information body in Mexico. As you know, Mexico is one of the founding members, and in their OGP process, their access to information oversight body was part of the discussion. So when there was a change in government recently in Mexico, civil society relied a lot on the help of this autonomous body to get the buy-in of the government, or to ensure that the government would continue with this agenda. In terms of how has there been this engagement, I think thus far it has been limited in other regions of the world. But there are two examples that I want to highlight. The first one is from Peru, where the Defensoría del Pueblo from Peru, the ombudsman there, they since the beginning, they were part of the National Steering Committee process in Peru. So they sat at the table together with the different CSOs and the different government agencies, and they participated in the discussions, preparing the action plan and discussing how to implement it. And the other case that it's also interesting is the case of Ghana, where similarly to Peru, the Ombudsman in Ghana sat in these discussions to see what was going to be included in the action plan and who would be responsible. And in the specific case of Ghana, the Ombudsman there also has responsibilities in terms of the implementation of one of the commitments. So it's not just about facilitating the discussion between government and civil society or monitoring, which is also important, but there is also this specific role that they have included in the action plan for them, and of course more can be done in this regard. I think there is a lot of space for engagement with the Ombudsman institutions. They can help monitoring the implementation of the action plans. They can help with the implementation of specific commitments. They can also work or coordinate with other accountability agencies in order to strengthen the overall accountability framework in the countries. But of course there are challenges, and these challenges need to be taken into account and need to be addressed. And there is the issue of capacity, and sometimes maybe it's not the case of the Nordic model, given the situation here, but in other regions of the world, in Africa and Latin America, in the Middle East, in Asia, there is the issue of capacity, and sometimes the Ombudsman it's overstretched in its functions. So they need more capacity, and also they need to build their capacity, not only in terms of numbers, but in substance as well. And of course, there is the other issue of independence, and whether or not the Ombudsman is perceived as a legitimate institution in the country, or has the capacity to mediate to perform this mediation function between government and civil society. But notwithstanding these challenges, it is key that we continue this discussion and we continue to delve deeper in terms of what can the Ombudsman, or what specific activities, functions, role the Ombudsman institutions can have in the OGP. And this is particularly important because, not only because of what the Ombudsman can contribute to OGP, which as I said is there's a lot of space for that, but also because given the OGP's one of the OGP's key characteristics is that of fostering peer learning among member countries and among agencies between countries. So through an initiative like OGP, together with other ongoing initiatives or institutions like the International Ombudsman Institute, we can facilitate these exchanges between member countries in order to build the capacity through peer learning of those institutions that need it, relying on the knowledge and the experience of the other institutions that already have it, like the Nordic Models right here. And with that, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luis. And the examples of Ghana and Peru and other places, how the Ombudsman role has stretched around the world. I'd like now to introduce from Finland, from the Finnish State Secretary and from the Ministry of Finance in Finland, the Finnish State Secretary, Sari Raassina.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to give you a small introduction what is going on in Finland on a OGP field at the time, and I give you an example of one model that these elements, new elements, can be implemented in our governance. In Finland, openness has always been an underlying value in the government. We are fairly proud of our past achievements on this area, and as Elizabet pointed out, openness is not an issue that can be considered accomplished. On contrary, it's never finished, and we have a lot to do. Partly because we still have some things from the past that we need to do better, but partly because times have changed and there is an increase in demand of openness from the civil society. Therefore, we need new forms of collaboration and governance. One important factor why we need to achieve pursued public management reforms in Finland in the last 2 decades is that we firmly believe that good public governance is a very important factor for competitiveness of our nation. When discussing of competitiveness, it's not just about nations anymore. Increasingly, we talk about the competitiveness of Europe in a global comparisons. It's not always obvious in the discussions, but openness and citizens' trust in government are vital cornerstones in success in economics. Our Finnish government is open, efficient, and uncorrupted, but still we have citizens who look at it from afar, powerless and without chance to influence. We are globally seeing a decline in trust in many institutions like corporations, religious organizations, and government. And we know trust once lost is hard to gain back. Unfortunately, we do not know scientifically very much about what affects trust, but we do know that there is a positive correlation between trust and openness. One of the trends in the 21st century is diffusion of the power from state to non-state actors. We all know that the role of ICT is very strong in this, access to more information by more people. For us in government, this means many things. One is that it will be growing difficulty for governments to get things done unless we adapt more collaborative governance and more horizontal structures. We have launched a large central government reform in Finland. One of its key projects is to develop overall steering systems in the government. We are in Finland quite effective in making decisions, but do we achieve the change planned and needed in society? Probably not as often as we should. Therefore, we need to reform our core processes, government program implementations, budget process, and law drafting so that they will work better together, are clearer and more open. But most of all so that these processes recognize the fact that outcomes cannot be achieved by governments alone. We have been good in consulting citizens, but now we need good working together with citizens as partners to achieve the outcomes and impacts needed. We need to have collaborative government also at the heart of the government. That means that the core processes, just not the outskirts. Sharing information is one key, but we must also work hard on present people a different range of ideas and visions for dialogue. We should endlessly devote ourselves on learning in the processes. A wise person has said, if leaders stop learning, then it's the end. Thus we need to structure our processes so open that we can have a chance of learning through an open dialogue. One core issue in collaborative government is the government commitment for our leaders. In Finland, our permanent state secretaries and leadership of our Association for Local and Regional Authorities have together signed the principles of open government. Maybe this is a slightly old-fashioned way, but still it's a very clear and strong signal of their commitment to open government and citizens' engagement. It is glance in this short time and on how it looks from the whole government perspective, but I would like to give you also a small example from a small organization's way of working more openly. The case I bring you is a case of the matriculation examination in Finland. The matriculation examination board and its secretariat is an organization that has responsibility for administering the examination, its arrangements and execution. The matriculation examination is held biannually, in spring and in autumn in Finland, all upper secondary schools at the same time. So there are 450 schools and 40,000 pupils taking part. And I can tell you that everything that happens around this examination is interesting, very interesting to media and also the society more widely. Everybody has opinions about this, and it's talked in coffee tables, in workplaces, among the pupils in schools, and everybody has some kind of an idea what questions or what forms of testing should be done and whether they're fair enough, and it's really a wild discussion that's going on every spring and every autumn in Finland. And the board has been previously considered very, very traditional and very closed and hidden organization where nobody really knows who is making the decisions of our youngsters' future on these matters. But right recently, they have taken a more collaborative approach. They wanted to involve everybody who wanted to join the reform project. First, they opened an open feedback channel so that it was possible to give feedback from the examination tests. They also published each night after tests a description what was a good answer to each question asked from the pupils. Then they went to start work of making the test itself digital. This is a huge task for such a small organization, so they did this too openly. They went unofficial groups in social media to ask for help. They contacted IT people in municipalities. They opened a designed web page and crowdsourced the whole process. They listened, they visited website discussions, and they talked about process openly. The idea is that in 3 years' time, the examination will be digital, and for this, the board introduced a hacker competition on the planned new operational system. The idea was to find out if there existed possibilities to misuse the system. As you can imagine, the hacker competition attracted worldwide attention, and it also provided extremely useful. It brought out previously unknown weaknesses in the planned system. Their work continues, and they are currently working, for instance, clearer language and visualization of decisions and digitalization of whole decision-making system. Some English words are impossible to pronounce for Finn. When we asked them what was behind of all this, what was needed to change the way they had previously done, the answer was, you need horrible word again. But you understand what I mean. Innostunut is the word in Finnish. So that it shows. You need to have courage, because to make things differently, there is always resistance. And you need courage to also discuss issues and things that are not ready yet. You need time, because you need time, a little bit more time in the beginning when you start doing things differently. And you need ideas, but ideas you can get from the networks. And then you need thick skin, because not all the feedback is positive. I think that the idea behind of this case is worth telling, because here is a way of working collaboratively in today's world, and it's already been found. Of course, this is not the only case around, and I hope that through our OGP process, many such more cases will start to mature into the real changes, the way we do our governance. There might be a big new development projects. Of course, we need the major changes, but they also can be tinier changes, but still significant in people's everyday lives. We do need a thick skin, but it's good to remember that it helps that there is resistance. We should not follow the advice and stop what we are doing, but it's good that we need to justify our ways of thinking. They do not stop us, but they help us to think things over one more time. Here today we're surrounded with people who as eager as ourselves to take the work forward. This is a time to give and get encouragement. We from Nordic countries, we are not here to teach. We are here to learn. And I think that there is a big difference. I'm very, very happy to be here today, to be part of this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And as we move from talking about the traditional institutions such as the Ombudsman to the examples you gave there of using ICT and new technology to also generate openness and transparency, and good lessons there, I think, in terms of the enthusiasm, courage, and particularly a thick skin that politicians and senior civil servants need in order to go the distance in terms of doing things differently and opening up governance. Last but not least at all, I'd like to invite our Danish contribution from the Danish Ministry of Finance, Agency for Digitisation, and working as a special advisor on their open government and open data innovation strategy, Catherine Lippert.
Thank you very much, Nat. Good afternoon, everybody. It's really great to be here. As Nat said, I represent the Danish Ministry of Finance, and we are responsible for the coordination of Denmark's participation in the OGP. I'm not an expert on access to information. I'm not an expert on the Ombudsman institution, even though we've had an Ombudsman for a long time in Denmark. I'm going to talk to you about open government data. As you may know, Denmark is a highly digital country, and the Danish public sector is big, and it's involved in many aspects of processes in society. And that means the Danish public sector has a lot of data, which could be used for all sorts of things. And in fact, quite a lot of key data is already available. It's out there, but since we have so much more data could be available. The interesting thing is, though, that when we talk about open data, we rarely talk all that much about transparency. First, we talk about innovation and growth, how we can use open data as a digital resource to build things, to make a business out of that. Second, we talk about how we can use open data to improve public services, public administration, to make the public sector more efficient. And then third, we talk about how open data can actually help improve transparency. And it's not that we don't appreciate transparency or anything in Denmark. I mean, we have a freedom of information law. We've had it for a long time, and in fact we have I wouldn't say a brand new one, but a revised one which came into effect this year. And on top of that, we have the PSI law, which is the law that allows people to reuse the data that they can get through the Freedom of Information law. The thing is that usually when talking about freedom of information, it seems that people think about the press, that they can get access to key documents. A lot of people, of course, know that anybody can get access to documents. But when we talk about data, they focus on the PSI law, which gives them the right to reuse it. And they don't really seem to connect the two things, which may be part of the reason why we don't usually talk about open data and transparency in the same sentence. It's like it's two separate things. And I don't think anybody ever made a conscious decision about this, that this is how we want to see it. We want to think about it as a kind of three-tiered approach, or you could say a kind of pyramid of open data. It just sort of happened. And of course, working with open government, I have been thinking to myself, why is it? And one theory could be that we have a very high degree of trust in Denmark, in our government, but also, so it seems, in each other. And that may actually lead to some degree of complacency. We don't really have this sense that we need to push for more transparency. So when we talk about data, it's not really the transparency we're thinking of the business potentials in data. Nevertheless, I think there may in future we may see a stronger connection between open data and transparency because of a recent chain of events. In the beginning, when we launched the idea of opening up government data, that was in the beginning of 2009, and I worked on open government data back then. We always had to make sure that we made it very clear that we were not talking about personal data, because people were worried. And part of the reason probably is that the Danish public sector holds vast amount of personal information about citizens. Most of you probably know that we have like a national ID number for each citizen, which is used in every single transaction with the public sector. So that means, in theory, you could make a complete profile of a citizen if you wanted to. It's not legal to do it, and it's not being done, but in theory, you could do it. And many countries really don't understand how that can work. It probably has a lot to do with the trust I mentioned before. But the thing is, we had to be very careful to make it clear that when we talk about open data, we don't talk about personal data. But recently, I've found that when I talk about open data, people ask me, so isn't it true there could be potentials in also using personal data? And I think, wow, that's really incredible. Within 2 or 3 years, people have realized that we're not trying to just push out all of their personal data and give it away to whoever wants it, but they're starting to realize that maybe this could be used for something. The thing is, though, that even though people have realized that we're not trying to push their personal data, for example, to private companies, a couple of weeks ago, Denmark woke up to screaming headlines, scandal, celebrities' credit card transactions have been sold and used by a media company. And it turns out that the company which is responsible in Denmark for operating credit card transactions, one person who worked for this company, who was a systems administrator and had access to all systems, it seems that for years he has been selling credit card transaction data from these systems to a media company. And that helped, of course, the media company write interesting stories about these celebrities, where they were on holiday and who they were holidaying with, and lots of interesting things. And that has really brought back the discussion of personal data and privacy. And of course, at the moment, like many other European countries, we are also engaged in a discussion about surveillance. And that is really important in a country where it's very easy, if you want to track citizens. There is some worry that either companies or foreign governments could actually track what we're all doing. And at the same time, we are also discussing how major companies may actually be sold off to international investment firms and things like that, and what's going to happen to all that data that they hold if it's sold off. And when you put all those things together, you're actually in a situation where people start to be more interested in looking into government decisions about these things. So it seems to me that suddenly open data and questions about the openness may actually lead to an increased interest in transparency and understanding how government is making decisions about openness. So you could say that government's interest in allowing sales of companies can actually lead to a push for more transparency. You could say it's perhaps hard to improve on a system which is already quite open and transparent, but it's certainly not impossible, and it's no reason not to try to do it. But I would very much like to take the opportunity at this conference to talk to other countries and their experience about this, because it does seem a bit paradoxical for a country which really does value transparency and probably has a high degree of transparency that we're not talking about it. And what happens if we lose the ability to talk about it because nobody realizes the need for it? So I would very much like to hear from anybody who's got sort of tips and tricks on what to do in this respect. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Catherine. That very well rounds off our discussion about how new technology leads to new challenges in relation to openness and transparency, and the interesting mixture of having a society with a high level of trust because of openness, and yet the difficulty of trying to activate society to have the kind of vigilance that we need them to have, and we need all of our societies to have, of course, to maintain that transparency, and interesting tensions there. At this point, I want to open up the discussion to you. We have one or two roving microphones in the room, and there's an opportunity to get your thoughts. What I'll do is take 2 or 3 contributions from the room and then come back to those panel members who want to pick up and respond to them. We won't necessarily have every panel member respond to every point in order to give you more time to make more contributions. But to start off, does anybody like to make some remarks? And if you could say who you are and if you represent an organisation. Kind of a stunned silence for the moment. Well, maybe I'll take the opportunity as chair to pose a question to get the panel going. How do we strike that balance? How do we create a situation where citizens have confidence in public institutions, in public services, in how public money is being spent, but at the same time having the motivation to look into things, to see how the school exams are doing, or to see the details of where money is being spent, and to be vigilant? If anybody on the panel would like to take up that challenge. Elizabeth.
I think the obvious answer to that is media. You have to have educated and vigilant journalists, because they are like the watchdogs of democracy, and if you get the media interested, then the rest will follow. But I would like to, as a comment to the last speaker's intervention, say that we have in Sweden a very heated debate at the moment about a related issue, and that is the recently the court in Luxembourg struck down a decision or said that the Commission directive on, I don't know the exact term in English, but the obligation of telecommunication companies to keep their logs of the communication, the traffic log, so to say, to save them for at least 6 months, and I think no longer than 2 years or something, was not constitutional. I mean, it was against the European Constitution, and Sweden, this created an outrage, because Sweden was very late in implementing this directive, and it happened just after a long and heated debate in Parliament. Finally, we implemented it. We had to pay a fine of, I think, 3 million euros or something, or 30 million, I don't know. And now the situation has arrived that people have read about this decision from Luxembourg, and some telecom communication companies have publicly stated, okay, we don't care about the Swedish legislature because it's overruled by the court in Luxembourg, so we are trashing our registers. And the police, of course, is really upset about this. And it's created a debate about, of course, about transparency, and also, do we follow Swedish law or do we follow European law? And the government's response to this is that the Minister of Justice has appointed some experts to look into this matter and to present some kind of solution in 6 weeks from last week, I think. So this is, maybe this is not an answer to your problem, but it's another relief, so to say.
I was thinking in relation to your question, how do we strike this balance? We have perhaps a lot of transparency, but people get used to it, so they think they don't really have to do anything to push for more, or they don't have to perhaps, as you said, activate the transparency and actually use it for something. One theme in the current Danish OGP action plan is trying to strengthen local democracy, because one of the problems in Denmark is that although for general elections we have a very, very high voter turnout, for local elections it's dropping, and especially among young people. And that is really a problem for the future. If young people just sort of give up on local democracy, is it really a local democracy? And then also, how do you recruit for local government? And so actually in the Danish action plan, we've tried to come up with some initiatives that could perhaps encourage young people to at least use their opportunity to vote. And there was a campaign, we had local elections in November, and there was a campaign to try to stimulate young people to understand that they could actually influence local matters by voting locally. But that is only one little thing. But I would think it's very important to understand already from an early age that all the privileges you have and the access to information you have, if you're not using it, I wouldn't say it's useless, but it's very close to useless, so you have to make sure you use it for something.
Sorry, you wanted to come in there.
If somebody has the answer for the question, please tell it now, because I think that is something that if we could find the ways of dealing with that specific issue, we would go very far with these problems that we're facing. I agree with both of the answers here. We have the similar situation in Finland. There is less interest for the elections, and people find that they don't have really influence on the matters in the governmental level and also in the local level. And I think that we are in Finland facing very big changes in the structures of the municipalities, and also we are facing changes in our central governance. And also media, but the people are very interested in how they are organized, how the organization structures will function and how they are built. But we should point out how the governance is working, what are the possibilities for the people to take approach for and to be part of the processes. But that's something that's very difficult with the media to work out, and I think that that's something that we should find ways to make people in a way participate more. And once again, if somebody has good ideas, how is this done, I'm eager to hear.
I'm going to come back to the rest of the panel, but I have a couple of requests on the floor. Go ahead.
Thank you very much to fascinating speakers. I just want to pick up on the very engaging presentation of Catherine about the open data and its use in Denmark. In the session before lunch on open data. I was, as a representative of Georgia and the coordinator of OGP, I was trying to highlight the objective that the open data needs to acquire in Georgia, which is completely opposite from, at the moment, from what was just illustrated. In Georgia, open data or the public sector information is more used as a tool for transparency and accountability rather than the stimulus for economic growth. So I was thinking as a joke, when there is no demand for transparency, there is nothing to worry about. I think in Denmark, which is considered to be one of the happiest country, or the people, happiest people, there is no demand side. Let's leave it to the economic growth. But the question that I had was about the use of the open data. And as you said, Catherine, since 2009, when the open government data has started, I was wondering what is the most tangible use of it, and if there are any already existing initiatives built on the open government data. I'm sure that there are, but if you could highlight a couple of those. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a couple more contributions from the floor. Gentleman there in grey.
Hi everyone, my name is Damir from CPI Foundation from Bosnia and Herzegovina. My question is almost similar like the one before. If you guys from Ministries of Finance could just give us a few examples of any economic benefits you had from opening the government data. And a question to Peter. I don't know if I'm right, but I heard that there are some fees regarding the information requests. So my question is, do citizens have any discount on the amount of requests they're asking, or it gets even more expensive for them when they ask, number versus the price? Thank you very much.
Okay. Towards the back there in the yellow jacket.
Hello, thank you very much for your contributions. My name is Edward Stevenson, and I'm part of the Civil Society Forum in Dublin. I'm looking at Minister Howland's bill, and I'm reading a clause which states that where a dispute arises between the Commissioner and any prescribed body as to whether this act applies to an element of that body, the dispute shall be submitted to the Minister, whose determination shall be binding on the Information Commissioner and the body. I wonder if that's universal across all of the systems that the Nordic countries operate, and for Mr. Tyndall, whether he feels that this means that if he feels strongly about something, he's not entitled to go to court and argue the case in law.
Okay, take one more contribution from the other side.
Donald Rollicon. I want to revert to what the opening speaker, the ambassador, said about democracy and the development of democracy. And there was a guy with a Scandinavian name, Mansur Olsen, who's now dead, but he was an academic in the States, and he wrote about the influence of what he called distributional coalitions. And when you listen to ombudsmen talking and people talking on their reports, a lot of the things they talk about are where an individual has been, let's say, not dealt with fairly or properly by an agency. And it's all on the individual case. But I think there's something much more insidious that I think we have to face in Western Europe now, and we certainly are conscious of it here in Ireland, and that is the impact of distributional coalitions on policies that within which the ombudsmen have to work, the ombudsman's office. And the real question is given the power of, for example, money that we've seen in Europe, and the way that this operates in a stealthy democracy way, not in an open democratic way, what rethinking is going on among ombudsmen's offices about their role in dealing with these distributional coalitions and the deleterious effects they have on, because what they do in effect is they maintain the status quo, they don't allow much change, and this, according to this theory, the society eventually atrophies because it does not allow challenges to the incumbent ways of doing things. So have the Ombudsman's offices, collectively or individually, thought beyond that to rise to the challenge set down by the Norwegian ambassador to the kind of future of democracy in terms of developments, which he kind of said, well, we're at the end of a 250-year era and we're about to fail if the Greek experience is anything to go by.
Okay, thanks, Donald. So a range of contributions there from the floor, and I'm going to invite the panel to pick and choose among them where you'd like to pick up the conversation and respond. Would anyone like to volunteer to? Louis, yeah.
Previous question?
Yeah.
No, I think that's a very good point. But just to illustrate, because I think it depends on what you want, and if you're looking at participation as a tool to achieve something or as a mean in itself. Just the example that I want to give is the University of Queensland in Australia. They conducted a research not long ago about how were parents using information publicly available about school performance. So in the schools that their kids were going to, and the information included different education indicators, student-teacher ratio, teachers' attendance, performance in schools, etc. And this information was available on the internet. And what they found is that parents did not use that information to make decisions on where to send their kids to school. They didn't care about that information at all. That was not a factor. However, there was an improvement in the performance of all the schools, and this was because the principals knew that information was public. So they feared the publicity of this information, regardless of whether the parents cared or not. So I just wanted to put that example because it illustrates, how sometimes transparency may not encourage participation, but it will have certain impacts regardless.
There are a couple of questions directed at me, which I'll come to in a moment, but I just wanted to pick up that final point about the role of Ombudsman and does it go beyond the individual, dealing with the individual matter and in a sense, can Ombudsman be players in refreshing the wider democratic process? I think if that's a fair characterization of the question. No Ombudsman I know ever stops looking for systemic solutions. They look at complaints. Sometimes it's a one-off. It's a mistake by a public official. There's nothing to be done except put the citizen back where they should have been. Oftentimes, though, you'll find two other kinds of complaints, some of which suggest that the organisation concerned or the public body concerned is simply not capable of doing the job properly for whatever reason. And then you look to go beyond the individual complaint to try and correct things for that body. But sometimes the failings lie in the regulations or the legislation. So it's not unusual, and I think Arne probably touched on this, it's not at all unusual for Ombudsman to say there was an injustice here, but there was no breach of the law. And the law itself is unjust. I think the example of that, to use an Irish example, my predecessor looked at the situation of grants for people with disabilities to access transport. And those grants were available to people with disabilities who were not older people, but people who became disabled because of age couldn't access those grants. And she quite properly said that although that's what the law says, that clearly is discriminatory, and it's in breach of equal rights. And she spoke out very strongly against that. Government is thinking about its response. So I think Ombudsmen have a role to play in looking at not just the individual failings, but whether those individual failings have a wider base. And I think that's one of the strengths of the institution and why it has thrived. And when you look at the role of ombudsmen in some of the emerging democracies, if you take our colleague in Slovakia at the moment is under very considerable attack. Her annual report has been rejected by her parliament because of the work she's been doing on behalf of the Roma community there. I think there are many examples of that kind internationally where ombudsmen actually do step well beyond being part of an administrative response to failure and step into the public arena in order to redress wrongs that affect more than one individual, but often classes of people. Now, there are a couple of questions directed at me. One of them perhaps arose from the fact that my former colleague discarded the green jersey and offered it to me this morning on the issue of fees. What I said, when I presented my annual report as Information Commissioner yesterday, what I said on the subject of fees was that the proposals that are being brought forward, yes, there are fees in Ireland. I think that's been touched upon. There are fees both up front and fees for retrieval of information. What's being proposed, and Minister Howland, when he spoke this morning, was very clear that the suggestion is that those fees for retrieval of information may well disappear as part of the consultation on the new legislation. We're currently awaiting the outcome of the consultation on the legislation. It's before a parliamentary committee. It's important to clarify that people seeking personal information, which is the vast majority of requests for information, don't have to pay fees. So from that point of view, it's not as clear a picture as it would seem. I think that the moves to reduce fees is a very welcome step forward. I think, as the Minister himself said, that in the longer term, we would all prefer to see fees abolished. And the sooner that the financial climate allows that to happen, as far as I'm concerned, the better. But I understand the constraints that the Minister is operating under, and also the fact that it does represent that we continue to move in the right direction, and some of the constraints upon freedom of information in Ireland that were introduced by a previous government are being removed through this legislation, and freedom of information is being extended. And those, I think, are things to be welcomed. As always, it can go further. The very detailed question about the determination by the Minister as to whether an aspect of the work of a body in my jurisdiction, which is not, just to be clear, some bodies will come into jurisdiction of freedom of information legislation in Ireland, but not the whole of their activities. The police, for instance, there will be elements of their activities that fall outside the legislation. As it's currently determined, it's the Minister who would decide whether or not something fell within or without. I think that's a subject which, as was hinted by the questioner, is likely to be the subject of continuing lively debate, and when a test case arises, I suspect that's the point at which we will see how that operates in practice. I think it is one of the areas of the legislation which has drawn a lot of comment, and it remains to be seen what the final legislation looks like.
Okay. I see one more question there, Evan.
Thank you, Nat. I just wanted to come in on that last point to help out Peter on the matter. First of all, just say I'm Evelyn O'Connor from the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, and one of my responsibilities is actually to develop the Freedom of Information Bill. And first of all, just to say that in relation to the FOI bill and in fact in relation to the Ombudsman 2012 Act, the department has worked very closely with the Office of the Information Commissioner and with the Ombudsman's Office. Could I just explain that when we were developing the Ombudsman's Act 2012, there's a similar provision in that Act, and that provision was actually inserted in the bill at the time at the request of the Ombudsman's Office. Of course, none of us want two state bodies to be fighting each other and going to court as to whether they should be included or not, in whole or in part, under the remit of the Ombudsman or the Information Commissioner. I think most of you may know that the programme for government, and that's the line our Minister is following, is to bring as many public bodies under the remit of the Ombudsman and under the remit of the Information Commissioner as possible. And as Peter has explained,
because the definition that we're using and the approach that we're taking is that all public bodies will come under remit unless there's a specific exemption. It's for that reason that we have a schedule to the bill, and we're setting out very clearly what that exemption is and to whom it applies. So that's one aspect. But there has been cases in the past where one state body has gone against another body. Our minister is taking the line they should be in to the greatest extent possible, and that's the line that he's going to be taking and fighting. So, you know, I just wanted to emphasise that it's not that he wants to take away from the remit of the Ombudsman or the Information Commissioner. He wants to assist and diffuse any situations that arise. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm conscious of the time. I want to give a chance to any member of the panel who wants to make any final comments. I think we've said everything that can be said. There'll be an opportunity to chat with any member of the panel over a cup of coffee in a moment. I suppose what we've seen today is that they thank the panel again for their contributions. I'd like to join this. Thank you all for your participation, and there's now an opportunity to have a cup of tea or coffee and to indeed talk to any of the panellists, and thank you very much for your attention.